What is up, party people? Today we'll be going over an in-depth guide of counting and rhythms. Now, counting can be a little confusing at first, but with enough practice, you become a counting pro. Counting is a really important skill to know, and it makes reading music and figuring rhythms out way easier than if you didn't know how to count. I'm joined with my penguin, and we'll be tackling counting. So let's get this party started. So the majority of music is written in the time signature 4/4. This is also known as common time, which is also notated as the letter C in a piece of music in the beginning. So 4/4 is the same thing as writing the letter C. It's called common time because 4/4 is the most common time signature used to write music. There are of course many other time signatures such as 3/4, 2/2, 6/8, 12/8, and many more. Today we will be focusing mostly on 4/4 because most of the things in 4/4 can be applied to any other time signature. In any time signature, the top number tells us how many beats are in each measure, while the bottom number tells us what notes get that beat. So in this case, the 4 on top means there are 4 beats per measure, while the 4 on the bottom tells us we are dealing with quarter notes. And if you look at this chart, these are the numbers that can be on the bottom. 1 would indicate we are dealing with whole notes, which you won't see this. 2 would indicate we are dealing with half notes. 4 would be quarter notes, 8 eighth notes, and 16 16th notes. So if we had a measure of just quarter notes in 4/4, it would be counted as 1, 2, 3, 4. So each note receives a different amount of counts or beats. This bad boy over here is a whole note and receives all 4 counts within a measure of 4/4. So a measure of a whole note would be counted as 1. This whole note can be divided into 2 half notes. One half note receives 2 counts. So a measure of half notes would be counted as 1, 3. Half notes can then be divided into quarter notes, and one quarter note receives 1 count. So a measure of quarter notes would be counted as 1, 2, 3, 4. These quarter notes can be further divided into eighth notes. 1 eighth note takes up half a beat, so it takes 2 eighth notes to make 1 full beat. To count a measure of just eighth notes, it would be counted as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. These eighth notes can then be further divided again into 16th notes. Man, that's so crazy. 16th note receives 1/4 of a beat, and if you notice, each note previous to the other note receives halves the beat. So 4 divided by 2 equals 2, 2 divided by 2 equals 1, then it just keeps dividing into halves. That's so crazy. Basic math. Whoa. Now, like I said, 16th note receives 1/4 of a count. So to count a measure of just 16th notes, it would be counted as 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a. Now, as for eighth notes and 16th notes, you may be more familiar with eighth notes written as this, and that's basically the same thing because it just combines 2 eighth notes. 2 eighth notes combined is equal to 1 beat, so it would just be counted as 1 and. Same thing can be said about 16th notes. You may be more used to it looking like this. This is the same thing as just writing 4 individual 16th notes. So it would be just counted as 1E and a. Now, like I said earlier, these 16th notes can be even further divided to more tiny notes. But usually you don't have to worry about those notes unless you're a woodwind. Then, oh well. Now there's another group of notes called triplets that are also very common in music. They can be annotated in various ways, such as just a 3 or a bracket with a 3, or the loop-de-loop with a 3 on top. But they all mean the same thing. To count a measure of just triplets, it would be counted as triplet, 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 triplet. Or it can be counted as 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They mean the same thing. Now, essentially, there are 3 notes within one singular beat. An easy way to remember what a triplet is just to remember that the prefix tri means 3. So like a tricycle has 3 wheels, and a triplet has 3 notes within one beat. The same thing can be said about rests. A whole rest receives 4 counts, half rest receives 2, quarter rest receives 1, and it keeps dividing into halves just like before with the notes. An easy way to remember the difference between a whole rest and a half rest is to remember that a whole rest is facing down. The word down has 4 letters in it, while a half rest is facing up. The word up has 2 letters in it. Now, an important thing to remember when we're dealing with rests is that we do not count rests out loud. Likewise, we do not play rests while we are playing our instrument. So to give an example, if we had a measure of just a whole rest, we were counted as... We don't say anything because it's a rest, and during rests we don't play, so we don't count rests. Since 4/4 tells us we can only have 4 beats per measure, we can never exceed 4 beats within one measure. To give an example, if we had a measure of just a whole note, we cannot add any note or rest within that measure because a whole note takes up all 4 beats. If we wanted to add, let's say, half notes, we would have to create a whole new measure to add those half notes. Then that would work because these 2 half notes together combine 4 beats. Now that we know how many beats a note or a rest receives, let's try some examples. So with any measure in 4/4, or any time signature for that matter, we always know 100% for a fact that no matter what the first note or rest is, it will always be on beat 1. Everything must start on beat 1. So, can write 1. Now, if you recall from earlier, a half note receives 2 counts. Therefore, this half note takes up beat 1 and beat 2. Now, if you will notice, let me zoom in. I wrote 1 bigger, but I wrote the 2 smaller. This is so I know what the downbeat of this note is, but the smaller number tells me the full value, which will make more sense as we go further into some examples. So now that all of beat 1 and all of beat 2 are taken up, we know that the next note or rest must be on beat 3. Therefore, this quarter rest must be on beat 3. And since it is a quarter rest, it only receives 1 beat, so it receives all of beat 3. Now we only have 1 beat left within the measure, beat 4. Now we have 2 eighth notes. If you remember, an eighth note receives half the beat. So this 1/8 note receives half of beat 4, while the other eighth note receives the and of 4. And this is how you would write the counts in for this rhythm. Now, when you're learning how to count and stuff, it's always a good idea to just write out the counts, especially for more complex rhythms. This will really help just make sure you're playing the notes exactly where their beat is. Now that we know the rhythm of this measure, let's try counting it. This measure would be counted as 1, 4, and. I'll do it one more time. 1, 4, and. When we are counting, we're only concerned with the beginning of the note, and we don't actually count out loud the full note's value. This is why the 1 is big and the 2 is small. This tells me that this half note receives beat 1 and 2, but when we are counting, we only say beat 1. We think about beat 2 in our head, but we don't actually say it. So I'll do it one more time just to show it. 1, 4, and. In my head, while I was counting, I was thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, and. But I didn't actually say 2. Now, an important thing to remember about counting and playing in general is that we always want to be subdividing in our heads, especially when we're playing more complex rhythms. Subdividing in our heads ensures that we're placing the note exactly where the beat is supposed to be. And by subdividing, you may recall that a measure of eighth notes is counted as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. When we're dealing with very syncopated rhythms, we want to make sure we're thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and in our heads, as if a metronome were going off in our heads, to make sure that we're playing the notes exactly where the beat is. It may also even be necessary to subdivide in 16th notes. So in our heads we're thinking 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a, depending on how complex the rhythm is. Again, this is to really make sure that we are actually playing the note where it's supposed to be, rather than just guessing where the note is. And now we'll do a few examples where subdividing is needed in order to make sure we're placing the notes where they're supposed to be instead of just guessing. Alright, so here's another example. I encourage you to pause the video really quick and see if you can figure it out. Alright, let's break this down. So we're in 4/4, and we know that no matter what the first note is or rest, it must always be on beat 1. So we can put beat 1. Since this is a quarter note, it takes up all of beat 1. Therefore, we know that the next note or rest must be on beat 2. Now, since this is an eighth rest, it only takes up half of beat 2, meaning that the other half of beat 2, the and of 2, must be on the next note. In this case, the next note is an eighth note, so this eighth note takes up the and of 2. Now that 2 is complete, we know that the next note or rest must be on beat 3. Therefore, this eighth rest must be on beat 3. Since it is an eighth rest, it only takes up half of beat 3. So the and of 3 must be on the next note, which is an eighth note. And since it is an eighth note, it only takes up half of it. Now we're only left with one beat left, which is beat 4. So this note must be on beat 4. And since it is a quarter note, it takes up all of beat 4. Therefore, this measure is good. Boop. Alright, now let's actually count measure 1. So, to count this measure, it would be counted as 1 and 4. I'll say it again. 1 and 4. Remember that since this is a syncopated rhythm, we want to be thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and in our heads to make sure we are placing the note exactly where it's supposed to be. Now let's go over the counts of the second measure. Now, we have an eighth rest, but we always know that whatever the note or rest is, it must be on beat 1. Therefore, this 8th rest is on beat 1. Since it is an 8th rest, it only takes up half of beat 1, meaning that the and of beat 1 must be on the next note, which is a quarter note. Now, since it is a quarter note, it needs another half to be complete. Therefore, this quarter note also takes up beat 2. Now, since this only took up half of beat 2, this quarter note, the next note must be on the and of 2. And in this case, the 8th note is on the and of 2. And since it is an 8th note, that's all it receives, because the and of 2 is just half, and the 8th notes receive half a beat. So now that beat 2 is fully completed, we know that the next note must be on beat 3. So this 8th note is on beat 3. Since it is an 8th note, we know that the next note must be on the and of 3, since the 8th note only takes up half a beat. Therefore, this next 8th note is on the and of 3. Now that all of beat 3 is complete, that leaves beat 4. So this quarter note must be on beat 4. Since it is a quarter note, it takes up all of beat 4. And now we're good with the measure. Now that we know the counts of measure 2, let's actually count it. Now before we count it, I want to make a quick correction. Instead of the and being small and the 2 being big, it should actually, the and should be bigger and the 2 should be smaller. And it will make more sense when we actually count it. So to count this measure, it will be counted as and 3 and 4. Do it one more time. And 3 and 4. Now the reason why I switched the and being tiny to big is because we actually say and when we're counting this note. We don't actually say 2. Therefore, I just wrote the 2 to be tiny. So this tells me that I know this quarter note takes up the and of 1 and 2, but when I'm counting, I only say and. Now that we know the counts of both measures, let's combine the 2. Now remember, it's important to subdivide in our head 1 and 2 and make sure we're actually placing the notes where they should be. So let's try counting these 2 measures together. So it would go 1 and 4 and 3 and 4. Let's try it one more time. 1 and 4 and 3 and 4. Now, this rhythm should be familiar to you all because it's from our fight song. Woo! Now let's try one more example. This may look a little scary, but I encourage you to just pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Alright, let's get this started. So we know that this 8th note must be on beat 1. You'll notice that the next 2 notes are 2 16th notes. Remember that 2 16th notes are the same as one singular 8th note. And since we're dealing with 16th notes, we're going to have to subdivide and count this out using 16th notes. Therefore, we can say that this 8th note takes up 1, and it also takes up 1 E. Since 2 16th notes is equal to 1 8th note. Now we have 2 16th notes, and 1 16th note takes up a fourth of the beat, meaning that this 16th note takes up and the and of 1, and the next one takes up the of 1. This 8th note combined with these 2 16th notes together make up all of beat 1. So now that beat 1 is complete, we know that the next note must be on beat 2. In this case, we have 2 8th notes. So since it is an eighth note, the first eighth note takes up half of 2, while the next eighth note takes up the and of 2. Now that beat 2 is complete, we know that the next note or rest must be on beat 3. So this 16th rest must be on beat 3. Since it is a 16th rest, it only takes up a fourth of beat 3, meaning we have E and left. And you'll see that we have 3 16th notes left. So each of these 3 16th notes receives 1/4 of beat 3, meaning this 16th note receives E, the next receives finally the last one takes up one E and my bad, I meant this is and so together this 16th rest plus these 3 16th notes make up all of beat 3. Now that all of beat 3 is over, or done, or completed, we know that the next note must be on beat 4. In this case, beat 4 is a quarter note, meaning it takes up all of beat 4. And with that, this measure is now complete. Now that we know the counts of this measure, it's actually counted. So it would go like 1 and a 2 and E and a 4. Now I'm gonna put on a metronome just to be sure I'm being counting the rhythm exactly where it's supposed to be. And I'm putting it as 16th notes because we want to be thinking 1 E and a 2 E and a in our heads when we're counting this rhythm. So here we go. 1 and a 2 and E and a 4. I'll do it one more time. 1 and a 2 and E and a 4. Now, when we're dealing with rhythms that have 16th notes or are really syncopated, we must always subdivide. If there's one thing I want you to take from this video is that you gotta subdivide. You must always subdivide. And depending on what the measure has, you're either subdividing eighth notes, so in your head you're thinking 1 and 2 and, or if it's more complicated, you're subdividing 16th notes, so you're thinking 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a. Subdividing is really the only way where we know for a fact we're playing the notes exactly where they should be instead of guessing. And nice job. There you have it, party people. In-depth guide explaining counting, rhythms, and all that fun stuff. Now, we mostly just focused on 4/4, but like I said earlier, if you know the basics of 4/4, you can pretty much figure out any other time signature. So for example, 5/4, the rules still apply. Quarter note in 5/4 still receives 1 beat, half note in 5/4 still receives 2 counts, and so on and so forth. And the same thing can be said about 3/4, 2/4. The rules still apply. It mostly depends on what the bottom number is. Now, the difference really between something in over 4 or 8 is just how you think about it. But that can be explained more in a separate video or myself telling you. But really, the basic idea is still the same. But hopefully this video helped you understand counting. And hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully it wasn't too long or too boring. See you around, party peeps. I'ma go party. Bringing my penguin. Whoop.